Welcome to the Freelancing Friends podcast, the podcast that gives you the insight you need to become the best freelancer you can be. Be sure to head on over to freelancingfriends.co.uk, join the community, and enhance your freelancing career today. In this episode, we speak with a very special guest, Stephen Kenwright, a successfully exited co-founder of Rise at 7. We discuss the ins and outs of growing a business, an agency owner's perspective on working with freelancers, and how you can niche down and grow your own personal brand within the world of digital marketing. Stephen, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's much appreciated.
No worries at all. I've been looking forward to this chat.
Same here. I suppose very shortly we'll go through why. But I suppose for now, it might be quite useful for, obviously, the listeners to get a bit more information on yourself.
Sure. So I have been doing marketing stuff more broadly than just digital stuff, I guess, for about 12 years, just coming up to 12 years. Started agency side and did a lot of my career at an agency called Branded 3, which was a search specialist agency. I was there for about 6 years. And during that time, Branded 3 got acquired by what was then St. Ives Group, which was a print house historically and doing lots of things like point of sale. But I mean, even printing the original Harry Potter books, for example. And the acquisition of Branded 3 was part of this digital transformation into what has now become Kin and Carter. So it was a lot of fun to be involved in that in some small way and really seeing that organization take shape from what was lots of, 10 or more disparate agencies into one single entity was a lot of fun. Then after that, I went in-house for a little while at Pendragon PLC, where I looked after everything digital for Evans Halshaw and Stratstone and Car Store and a few of their other brands and projects as well. So that's everything from kind of the search stuff that I'd been doing historically at Branded 3 through to digital product like the site core development and the web-based stuff in that sense as well. And then straight after that, I launched Rise at 7, which was an agency. We started, me and Carrie Rose started in Sheffield. There were 2 of us, then there were 110 of us, and that happened pretty quickly. And you were one of that 110, which is how we met properly, I guess. And that was a rapid growth and a rapid turnaround. And now fast forward to where we are now. I sold my stake in the agency to my business partner, Carrie, and she runs and continues to run the agency herself. I am currently on leave, I guess, having a break before really thinking about what I want to do next. Maybe next year, something like that.
Perfect. So, obviously, as you touched on there, that would be how we met in that story. So you obviously started Rise at 7. I'd known of yourself before anyway from a lot of the talks that you've done and just kind of chat around the industry as well. And then one specific night, I decided to apply for the job at Rise for the SEO role that was going there. And yeah, obviously from that point, we kind of met up, had a few chats, and I suppose it rolled from there. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I suppose for the listeners' sake, it is a case of, we met at Rise. Yeah. But I think it was a good 3, 4, I could be wrong, maybe even 6 months where it was probably just us two on the SEO side of things, trying to just, I suppose figure out how we were going to grow that. Right, and I'm sure many people listening have heard of Rise at 7 anyway and kind of know where they are now. So it's very good to have you on. Obviously, what I wanted to do with the beginning of this podcast series as well, obviously it is primarily around freelancing and kind of how you go around that business. But I wanted to touch base with the people that I class as like the key people within my career who have helped out in some way, shape or form. Obviously, there's a lot of people in different ways, yourself being one of them. Just to reiterate there, it wasn't Stephen telling me I should go freelance. That wasn't the case. But you have also been instrumental in terms of, since I've gone freelance, obviously we've met up quite a few times as well. We live fairly close by. and just kind of generally have that chat. So I kind of wanted to obviously get you on the podcast and have a bit of a chat in terms of, I suppose, the marketing aspect in general, but there's a few key points that I think we could probably touch on together. One would be obviously working with freelancers from an agency owner's perspective. The other would just be growing a business.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose anyone in the marketing industry knows how rapid Rise grew itself, and still continues to, by all means. So I thought maybe first we could touch on that growing a business side of things. So I suppose if we take it back to day one of Rise, it was also a case of it was just you and Carrie.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously you weren't particularly freelancing as such, but there were just two people, and you obviously offered complementary kind of services to each other. So I suppose what I really wanted to talk about first was about that growing a business. So in terms of, was that the plan from day one? Did you always want to grow it to even the heights that it is now, for example? And kind of, I suppose, the core ins and outs of, you were a business owner, your business obviously grew. What were kind of the pros, the cons? What did you enjoy? I suppose just generally kind of throw a few questions about that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess the most obvious question there is yes, that was always the plan. I think if you grow a business, it doesn't usually happen by accident, and there are plenty of people who will be, trying to grow a business and can testify it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not a case usually of very high level of growth comes just from being right place, right time. It's recognizing that for sure, but also Rise, particularly with the level of growth it had to have this kind of single-mindedness about it was going to grow and where it was going to grow to and how it was going to grow as well, because it's ultimately, I think, you're making investments, you are placing bets on what's going to work, and you can't place too many bets because you're never going to have the bandwidth to keep checking them, right? You're not going to be able to do a good job for your clients, for your people, if you are in too many places at once. So I think that single-mindedness is quite important. And I think in a lot of senses, we can talk about growth as being the trap. I think really is, you think headcount, and headcount is a facet of growth, especially in an agency or a professional services business where, you are ultimately selling time. And there are different, there is some nuance that is not always time and be outputs and things like that. But the number of people you have is quite clearly, it dictates how much revenue you can make. So growth is headcount in that sense, but it's not always. And I think when you're a freelancer as well, you've got that constraint. If you want to have that constraint, I don't want to have more than just me to look after. I don't want to deal with pensions. I don't want to, worry about a lot of these other aspects that come with the people side of things. Growth means something different to you. It might be, I have 5 clients and I'd like them to be bigger clients. It might be, I want 10 clients. It might be, the level of impact that you can have for those clients. Whatever you're doing, it's growing. And I think it's a lot easier to do that if you're very deliberate about, I'm going to grow these things and I'm not going to care about these other ones.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose, obviously, your answer there kind of gave way to, I suppose, a couple of questions, but the first one being, obviously, when you're thinking of, I want bigger clients, so whether that be purely revenue based in terms of how much obviously they're going to pay you, or whether it be maybe more on a branded recognition. So we could call them maybe a household brand, for example. Obviously, Rise kind of probably covered both of those aspects. So I suppose even from the beginning, obviously I know yourself and Carrie had that kind of vision of, we want to work with these bigger clients. We don't just want to be stuck to the local clients or, whoever it may be. How did you kind of go about that initial pitch of saying, we might be a brand new agency of sorts, but we're going to, shoot for the stars and go for those big branded clients?
There are a couple of bits of history before Rise, really, where we were used to working with bigger brands. They weren't always the household names. They weren't necessarily the really famous or sought after brands, but in their industries, they were big brands. So we were quite used to working with the kind of clients that have complex organizational structures and have to make business cases for the things that they want to do and have to deal with, everything from a development team to a procurement team to independent legal counsel, all these kind of things. So we knew a fair bit about the client that we wanted to go after. But I do think it comes down to that single-mindedness. It's when we start out, it's about being not for everyone. It's for trying to understand the kind of clients that we are going for. What is it that they need? What do they not need? What are they fed up of hearing? And what are they wanting to hear more of? What would a solution to their problems really look like? And then saying, this is the solution. We are building something specifically tailored to brands like that. And, you're making a lot of these decisions quite early on in a business. There's a lot more businesses nowadays, for example, that are part of that B Corp movement and very interested in sustainability and very interested in social causes. And great, that's a very noble thing to be interested in. You're making some decisions when you are going after those brands. They have different requirements, they have different needs, they have different levels of governance involved. They also have a lot of agencies, freelancers, etc., chasing them for business all the time because they're the sexy brands. They're the ones that people want to work with now. There's nothing wrong with that. But, I think it is absolutely a case of being deliberate and going after this kind of client. These are the problems that I think this kind of client has. Ideally, talk to that kind of client. And I had an unfair advantage in having been in-house slightly before launching Rise and talking to a bunch of agencies about doing some work for Evans Halshaw as well, and thinking, I don't think that there's really anything out there right now that does what I need it to do. And if I need it to do it, surely other people do. And, we're also talking about a market that's quite mature and saturated in search, in SEO especially. There are a lot of agencies out there. And when it feels like a lot of them are saying the same sort of thing, you're not trying to be part of that growth movement where the market expands, it doubles every year. It's not, whether we've spoken about this before, the SEO market is in decline. It's in decline a lot more slowly than people think it is, but it's not growing bigger at the same rate that it used to be growing bigger. But if 5% of that market agrees with me about how I want to do things when I'm at my brand, that's millions, billions of pounds of revenue from solving a specific problem that I know a couple of people have. And I think, again, single-mindedness is a big part of that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I always agree. And it's one thing that I've tried throughout my freelance career so far is to kind of either touch base or obviously, primarily the idea would be to work with brands who resonate with me personally. And I think even from, it's a little bit easier when you're a freelancer and obviously you've probably got a lower amount of clients than obviously an agency would. But even as an agency, there is that kind of level of saying, you get to a decision where you're saying, are we just working with the brands that we agree with, whether it's values, anything else that they might be trying to achieve, or are we just going to take on anyone who comes to us that reaches maybe X budget or X amount of days per month? So it is really interesting to obviously hear that as well. And obviously, as we'll probably touch on quite a few times in this chat, looking at where Rise are now, obviously having that initial vision of working with those clients that agree with the way you do the work, it is very impressive, obviously, for that growth. Because I think specifically in SEO, I dare say in marketing as a whole as well, there's the core things that everyone call maybe best practices that we all know are X, Y, Z are all core to having better search performance, for example. But there's also multiple different ways to do everything that's actioned as well, which I think, obviously from a personal perspective, was what also drew me to work at Rise. Was we tended to have very similar kind of ethoses on how we would go around certain tasks. Mm-hmm. I've been in positions before, or I've got maybe contacts that have been in certain positions where that isn't always the case, and sometimes that can lead to obviously a few issues, which I suppose comes on to why you go freelance. Before we kind of touch on that, though, the second part of growing the business, or kind of what you obviously spoke about, again, differs very, very much between being a freelancer and being an agency. But I think a core thing there is pricing. So whether that's pricing based on an hourly, daily, or maybe even a monthly value, that's probably one of the biggest things, I think, for anyone in a business, whether you're a freelancer or running an agency, whatever it might be, and kind of deciding that, where do we sit? How much can we charge? How much is too little, but how much is too much? So obviously I know it's kind of different, obviously, what I'd charge now versus what Rise would charge, for example, or any agency. But how did you and Carrie kind of, or even I suppose from a perspective of yourself, because I suppose you and Carrie probably had slightly contradicting thoughts based on services. How did you kind of come to that approach of pricing, or what do you think, I suppose the better question would be, what do you think is the best way to approach that pricing structure?
I think, again, working backwards from the kind of client that you want to work with, if you want to work with household name brands, the first step in determining pricing, I think, is how much do household name brands pay? And rather than thinking about, I've got this time to sell and I have these expenses to cover, this is my mortgage, etc., I need to do at least this much work and therefore my rate, the floor of my rate needs to be this. It's more a case, I think, of saying, okay, this brand that we want to work with, let's say Go Compare, we know that they pay X agency X £100,000 per year to do this work. Okay, how can we be worth that? What do we have to do to make sure that we're worth that amount of money? And from day one, I would say we never, as far as I can remember, we never changed our day rates really at Rise from the first launch. We said we're expensive, or at least as expensive as places we'd worked before. We weren't trying to offer a cheaper alternative product. We were trying to offer good value, but the way that we thought we would add that value is by giving more, again, not in terms of time, but in terms of different and more wide-ranging impact to the kind of work that we did. That traditional digital PR, if we're now in post-digital PR world, adding those additional brand impacts and those more fame-driving moments to that SEO-driven PR mix, that was added value. Why would we charge less for it? And I think it's definitely helpful to know how much do you need to cost to survive. But I think it's also a case of your pricing is a statement of intent. And you go to a big brand and you look cheap. We've lost pitches that way. I remember one very specific global famous toy manufacturer. It's the one you're thinking of. We lost that one. And the biggest piece of feedback was we didn't cost enough. And, that was eye-opening, I guess, because when you're trying to think we can make ourselves a shoo-in by trying to charge less, you can't. If you want to work with those kinds of brands, you charge what those kind of brands are willing to pay, ideally, and then some. One of my favorite quotes, I love Cindy Gallop, she's amazing, and one of my favorite quotes of hers is, you ask for the number that's the biggest number you can say with a straight face.
Definitely. And I think it's probably a rarer situation, especially for a freelancer, but to be in a case where the feedback is you didn't charge enough, it's questionable. I think at times you start to sit there and think, the pub sounds like the best place for us to chat about this. But on the opposite side of that, and I think from a freelance perspective, personally, the pricing was probably one of the harder issues, I suppose, from starting up. So I've been relatively lucky. I suppose, obviously, having contacts such as yourself, obviously Jerry White as well. You two both played quite an instrumental part in how I am where I am now. But it was kind of choosing that initial, I suppose for me, I chose a day rate as an SEO, but people might choose hourly rates, whatever it might be. And kind of that worry of, am I pricing myself too high and pricing myself out of clients? So I think one thing that would be quite interesting to touch on there is anytime you maybe had clients come back to you, not even specifically at Rise, but at any point in your career, and saying, you're charging too much. And kind of that thought process of going, am I actually charging too much, or are they devaluing the work that I can actually offer? And I suppose your thought process around how that works as well. Do you always stick your guns in terms of this is the very minimum? Do you have maybe a percentage that you'd drop, for example? Or would it just be a straight red flag that this client doesn't understand the value of what we offer and therefore they're not the client that we want to work with?
I think it's not always a case of lack of understanding. I think it is sometimes a case that they're just not used to paying that amount of money. You know, they've worked with agencies, freelancers, whoever, or maybe they haven't. Right? They've been in house with their own department and are now looking to expand more rapidly than they have the bandwidth to be able to do themselves. I don't think it's always a lack of understanding. It's just not being used to paying that amount of money. I think you have the market test to decide whether you're on the right track or not, and Rise especially, you know, we probably at the busiest times had 10, maybe 20 phone calls a week where or you know, calls where we're at least backwards and forwards on email, you know, calls in a figurative sense, I guess, where we're talking about what might you need, how much might we cost, basically. And, you know, half, if not more than that, would be too expensive for them. But when you're thinking of it in terms of a funnel, if 2, 3, 4 brands are getting through that funnel each week and going, yeah, all right, that seems reasonable. Whether you win or not, they've said that seems like a reasonable amount of money to pay. You know you're on the right track with price. And no one loses on price, by the way. When you've lost and someone says it was price, they're usually lying. That's not really why you've lost. There's some unknown quantity a lot of the time, right? They just like that person more, and they don't want to say that because they don't want to hurt your feelings. It might be they had this specific bit of experience, they had an inside track. More often than not, they already knew they were going to work with that person, but they can't just give the work to that person because there are governance procedures in the organization. Most organizations have those. So price isn't often the real reason that you lose stuff. And when you get that mentality, I'm not going to lose this on price, I'm going to lose this by being a worse value to this client. You know, I'm not going to be as much value as someone else would, regardless of how much they're charging. You know, I don't necessarily think a freelancer needs to be cheaper than an agency. If the value that you add as a freelancer is you can get more deeply ingrained in that organization, and that's what that organization needs because they don't have the technical expertise to talk to the development team themselves, or that they don't have the knowledge to do these specific things that are what's really going to move the needle for them, right? You know, I don't think it needs to be cheaper just because you're a freelancer, but it doesn't work for every single brand, and you're pricing the customer, you're not pricing the job, I think is quite important.
Yeah, definitely. I think, obviously, I'm in agreement there. A lot of it does come down to, you know, it's not always them not recognizing what you do. It's kind of also pushing across the fact of what separates you from other people.
Mm-hmm.
So whether that's as a freelancer or an agency, every single one has got a difference. As we touched on earlier, you know, maybe in terms of your ethos of how you work, it might be values, etc. So I think that's always been one of the main questions I've been asked as well as a freelancer is, you know, not specifically how much do you charge, but how did you figure it out?
Yeah.
And I don't think there is a right answer for it as well, but I think a lot of it, obviously, as you say, comes down to there is a very minimum value that you need to live your life, to pay your bills, your mortgage, whatever it might be. So there's a core minimum value of what you need to earn. On top of that, you could go as high or as low as you want. A lot of it comes down to how many days do you want to work as well. Mm-hmm. You know, why have you gone freelance? Have you gone freelance because you want to do potentially part-time, 3-4 days a week, whatever it might be? And I think a lot of that is being confident in that price you choose as well. And I think that's probably the thing that I picked up most from working at Rise is there's a reason that price is in place and you need to stick to it. Sometimes it's easy to say, yeah, we'll give it you for half the price just to get a client on the books, but is it then going to be worth, you know, the amount of effort that goes into it as well compared to what you are making? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting kind of thing to touch on.
There's good reasons to discount, and Rise never really did, but you know, you've got capacity, you have time, you have more time than you need, right? You really wish you were working a bit more. You need some more money, that kind of thing. There is no reason not to take something on cheaper at a discount or whatever. But you're lying to yourself if you think they'll ever pay full price after that. You've got a short-term client here that's going to fill a gap, that's going to plug your capacity problem right now. They are never going to be a great client in the future. That's okay. As long as you're not pretending and holding on to them, thinking that they're going to change, they're not. And I think when it comes to like arriving at the price, when it comes to deciding how much you want to charge, etc., and pretty much every question that we're probably going to cover and that we usually cover in any conversation around growing a business, the answer is marketing, because the simple equation, I make it sound simple, it's hard work, but it's a simple concept. If you market your business and have more opportunity than you can handle, you feel quite comfortable saying no to stuff. You feel quite comfortable saying £1,000 a day. You feel quite comfortable pricing however you want to price. If you know that when I say no to this client, or if I, give them a number that's going to scare them off, that's okay, because there's another client. There's going to be another one tomorrow. There's going to be another one in a week or whatever. And that only comes from putting in the work on the marketing side of things, like all of the operational and everything, from pricing through to strategy, through to product, etc., all becomes academic if you have got demand. If you've marketed the business, if you've marketed yourself as a freelancer, you can do whatever you want. You charge what you like.
Definitely. I think you've kind of touched on something there as well, that sometimes, and I myself, I'm guilty of doing this as a freelancer, you forget that there still are those operational sides. While it's not to the level of obviously running an agency with maybe 100 staff members, there's still the operational side. You've got your taxes, accounting to do. You want to market yourself as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's fine having the business in and kind of obviously actioning the work that you need to do. But if for example, you've got a client on, let's say, a 6-month contract that ends in a month's time, and they're not going to renew for whatever reason, you need to be marketing yourself to push yourself out there. So it is quite interesting. I think, especially for me, obviously similar to yourself, I spent a lot of my time agency side in my career. And I think finding those similarities as opposed to the differences is probably what's most interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it is kind of that operational side and making sure everything's still running correctly. Are we priced correctly? What are the types of clients we want? Which obviously then does come down to, do you want to grow your business as well? Some freelancers are completely fine being solo, and that's the main reason they've done it. Some of them may want to start as maybe a freelancer, or it might be an agency, but it's just a solopreneur in the background and want to grow it. But a lot of it all comes down to the same thing of that kind of demand of who you want to work with. And, there'll always be demand for some companies out there, but are they the ones you want to work with?
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the next kind of topic that I wanted to touch on with you, which I thought was quite interesting, and this isn't even specific to Rise as well, because obviously you spent a lot of time at Branded 3 before, as you said, but it's working with freelancers when you are either an agency owner or very high up in an agency. So whether that be head of or running a team, for example, there's always going to be cases where agencies need freelancers to help, whether it's a very specific project or just to fill a few gaps for whatever reason. So in terms of that, from your experience, and I think what the listeners might find quite useful is, I suppose initially for this conversation is starting out with, how do you go about finding those freelancers, and kind of what are the decisions internally of, we've got the need for X freelancers in Y service. I suppose from there, the price or the costing does come from that and what the client pays you. But yeah, from an agency perspective, what's that initial kind of process, I suppose, of thinking we need to find some freelancers?
Almost always, in my experience, a freelancer has been chosen based on a personal relationship that I have or someone else in the business that, the owners trust. They've said this person can do that job, and we go, yeah, okay. it's quite rare then that it becomes a price negotiation. It's more about how long term and how much work this person needs to do for us. Because if it's a case of this client pays X, £5,000 a month, just plucking a figure out of my head, and we need £6,000 a month worth of freelance to support it, then well, clearly that's not a long-term gig that we can sustain. There's no point even having that client if we can't bring that in-house. But if it's, even a small client and it has this specific problem and someone who can solve that problem. I remember multiple times, we had a particularly taxing problem with site search, and I had this conversation with Luke Carthy at Sheffield DM not long ago. I know Luke Carthy knows his stuff about site search. He knows more than me. And even though I reckon I could probably do the actual bit of work that needed to be done, it would take me 5 days. And the cost of that to the business is X, really, because I'm not doing these other things that need to be done. Luke would cost Y in a sheer monetary amount, more than a lot of freelancers cost. But you're like, tick, no problem, because he can do that job and you're comfortable with it. Marketing, right? We know Luke knows his stuff about this stuff. And you could trace through lots of the freelancers that I've worked with, and I think that any of the businesses that I've been at, I've worked with, and go, oh yeah, that's why. Okay, they knew their stuff, and there was some corroborative supporting evidence to indicate that. So there's a couple of reasons that you would choose to work with a freelancer as an agency, particularly. Either the client has a problem that you don't have the expertise in-house to solve. It's a specific thing, and it might be a more technical problem than you've dealt with before. It might be languages. It might be a particular technology, website, CMS, or whatever that you want experience with. It's not, you can often think of agencies as being nefarious. We've sold in this thing we can't do. It's not always that. Sometimes it's, we've got this big job that we want to be doing, that everyone agrees that we'll be doing. The client also has this need, and they rely on us as a partner to help them get that done. We don't have that in-house, but we can get that done for them. So, additional expertise. Sometimes it's capacity, especially through some of the time that Rise was growing. We kind of came out of the COVID period where we were hiring and no one else was hiring, and all of a sudden everyone is hiring and there's money to spare, and it became that employees market. Everyone moves around, and what you can't do as an agency is let clients down while you're losing staff. You need to be able to support the contracts that the promises, effectively, is what it is, right? You've promised that you're going to do this stuff. You need to get it done. So you're going to have to find some external support. From a freelance point of view, that's probably a short-term gig, because you're always looking to replace that in-house if you can. That expertise-driven work, where you're the only person or one of the only people, or of a small number of people who know these specific things, that can be quite lucrative for the long term, really. And then, you've got that choice between working with in-house departments, with agencies. You also have agencies, right, who are very narrow in scope, who do this specific thing and don't have any real interest in housing these other things, but clients need them. It happens frequently. Maybe you're an agency that specializes in paid social, and naturally pick up organic social stuff all the time because the client doesn't want to split those things off. There's recurring work for a freelancer there if the agency doesn't want to in-house it, So again, it comes down to what the scope of the agency is, I think.
Definitely. I think one of the biggest things I found, especially at the beginning of my freelancing journey, but also I suppose even right through to today, and you'll find this kind of advice everywhere, but it's finding that niche, which can be quite difficult in marketing. As top level marketing is marketing, or digital marketing, for example, but you can get very, very specific within it. And I think I personally chose a few specific niches that were, I suppose, passions of mine, as nerdy as that might be sound, or the things that I enjoyed the most. And I suppose from an agency perspective, who might be looking for freelancers to work with, as you say, some of it does come down to personal relationships or prior relationships and knowledge of people in the industry. But does a lot of it come down to, or did you find that it is people within a specific niche? So Luke Carthy, for example, that you mentioned, obviously has niched down very well on e-commerce SEO. Was it kind of a case that you would always specifically want someone who focuses on a specific niche, or was there ever a need for someone who may be a bit more top level in it? So there are obviously freelancers that offer some of those more top level stuff as well and do it just as good as anyone else. So how was that kind of thought process from your side?
I think usually when it's working with a freelancer who is, let's say, undifferentiated, not specialized, who is a generalist freelancer, either you know what they are good at in advance, or you've got to put in the legwork to find that out. It's quite rare that, and every agency is different, but I wouldn't feel comfortable working in an agency and working with a client where I pretend that we can do this thing and we just can't do it, and we're always going to outsource that. And we need this top level person who can do all the strategy, who can go into each of the tactics and pull out what they need to pull out. Some agencies do that. I've never really liked doing that unless I'm going to be really transparent and say, we just don't do this. And if you need my help organizing that, okay. But I'm not going to pretend that, you're invoicing me and I'm invoicing them and all this kind of thing. It's always going to be a more transparent relationship than that. So when a freelancer is more generalist, it's usually a case that you kind of have in mind the thing that you need them to do. And by the way, like the most frequent source of referrals, I guess, that I am involved with is maybe the wrong word, but I have a couple of WhatsApp groups that I'm part of that have maybe 100 agency leaders in, and the ask was always going to be more specific than I just need a digital PR guy. It'll be, I need a digital PR guy who's good with financial services, or I need an SEO who can deal with this CMS. It's never just give me anyone. It's I've got this client, they're trusting me, I need to have this specific problem solved. There's always something specific. So you kind of have to, trust in the referrals from people who know what you're good at, or you've got to tell everyone what you're good at. And there's no getting around that. And even in a freelance capacity. And even if you think about the most famous freelancers in this industry, people like Aleda, you know what Aleda's good at because she talks about it at conferences all the time. She writes blog posts about it. You think, okay, international, you think e-commerce. This is the profile of brand that you want to tap Aleda up for, even though she's obviously got all of the broad knowledge in the world.
That's it. And I think a lot of, anytime, it's not even freelancers specifically, it could be agencies as well, where people can cover this full range of things, but if you're not going to be very specific about each one of those things, you could say, I can do on-page SEO, which is fine, but if you went, well, I can do copywriting, I can cover internal link building, kind of your UA and UI of kind of things as well, sometimes it is the same thing, but being more specific about it does help you kind of generate, whether it's the leads or even just people knowing you and that awareness of you as well, which does lead me on to something that's kind of in the middle of, I suppose, what we spoke about so far. And obviously, as I touched on earlier, even before I applied at Rise, I knew of you as a person. We'd never actually met physically, but I knew of you, I knew you existed, and I knew exactly what you did. So what, I suppose I'd say advice, but it's different for everyone, but how did you go about initially building that kind of awareness in the industry of the case where people were like, Stephen Kenwright, he knows SEO. Do you know what I mean? It kind of just building that awareness as well, to a point of where we've mentioned, obviously, Aleda, we've mentioned Luke, we've mentioned Jerry.
Mm-hmm.
9 times out of 10, just the first names, people would be like, oh, yeah, I know exactly who you mean. So sometimes it happens naturally as well, which could be the case, but was there anything you ever specifically did to try and kind of build that awareness?
I think it very rarely happens naturally. I think, however you slice it, it's hard work to build a reputation, and you've got to decide to do it. It might be that the spark comes from an accident. Maybe you get pulled into a conference at the last minute and you think, I really enjoyed that. Fine. That might have sparked the interest, but to actually build a profile, it's deliberate and it takes a lot of effort, and it takes effort outside of your normal working hours. Always, pretty much always. And that's different, a different concept to swallow for agencies or freelancers, because from an agency point of view, when I was growing up in Branded 3, Patrick Altoft and Tim Grice were the two kind of figureheads of the agency. I knew them before I went to the agency, and it was really obvious really early on that the way you progress in that place is to be an expert and share that expertise. It was a value, whether it was written down as a value on the wall or not. That was what the company really was about. So I thought, when I was maybe a year into my career, I need to do that. I'm going to put the legwork in and do it. And I was lucky. And again, being part of an agency, you do that on the agency's dime. The agency is paying for you to write blog posts, to go to conferences and those kind of things, which as a freelancer, you're out of pocket, right? I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying absolutely do it. But, in my personal circumstances, as you've said, I did that while I was somewhere else. So if you were in any way thinking about becoming a freelancer at any point, I'd do it now while someone else is paying for it. If you can, that's going to make your life a lot easier. And when we launched Rise, even, because we had done the work to build up that profile, and at that time I was more famous than Carrie because I'm older. I'd been around for longer and I've been doing it for longer. And she certainly caught up and surpassed me in that regard. But, we launched with an impact because we'd already done a bunch of work to get to that stage. I think you've got to decide to do it. And really, you've got to decide how you're going to do it and play to your strengths, because there are some people who are wonderful writers. There are some people who are great speakers. There are some people who like being on video. And there's people who don't like those things, right? Some people hate being on a video. Don't do a video. That's fine. Not everyone wants to do a video. Not everyone wants to listen to a podcast. Pick your lanes, 1 or 2, 3, whatever. Pick your social channels that you think will be good for you. The answer is LinkedIn, but use whichever ones you want, and you build up your profile from there. Long form content, start a newsletter. You see these kind of freelancers with significant followings popping up because you remember, they started that newsletter, and all of a sudden there's 1,000 people subscribing to Iona's digital PR roundup, and there's 10,000 people subscribing to. In fact, I'm probably doing a later in Justice with 10,000. She's probably got 1 million by now. But you start somewhere. It's a long slog, but you've got a single-mindedness, right? I said it a few times. You've got to just say, I'm going to do these things. I'm going to stick to them.
Definitely. I think it's really interesting as well. Obviously, as you've touched on there, I think that can apply to anyone freelance or employed by an agency or in-house as well. I would agree that LinkedIn is definitely the answer from a social channel. I know a lot of people, I know specifically myself, when I started my career, it was kind of one of them of, well, actually when I say my career, I did an apprenticeship and they made me sign up to LinkedIn. But outside of that, I didn't really use it for years. But that's kind of been pivotal in what I'm doing at the moment. And a lot of it does come to staying in your channel as well. It may seem a little bit contradictory. I've always been someone who doesn't particularly like my own voice or seeing myself on video, but I wanted to push myself to do the podcast, but also kind of offer that value to it as well. So I think sometimes you do have to think, let's pick the lanes, what we're really good at. So for myself, that would kind of been not keyboard warrior, but you know exactly what I mean. Just like kind of behind the screen on my own and kind of keep into my own little world. But sometimes there are times when you want to push yourself out of your comfort zone, and that doesn't mean you have to do the thing that you hate the most.
No.
Sometimes you can choose somewhere in between. So for myself, doing a podcast. But I think it is important to kind of, as you say, really focus on that of how do you feel comfortable And I think it's something probably throughout my career I've always had in the back of my mind, but I would say it was probably since I met and started working with yourself where I really kind of decided I am allowed to 100% be me and be exactly who I am compared to what the market might expect a marketer or an SEO or whoever it might be to be. Obviously, for anyone who does know me, that I'm quite alternative in terms of the piercings, the tattoos, etc. There was a time where even my parents, for example, worried I'd never get a job when I was a bit younger. So shout out mum and dad for that one. Hope you're listening. And obviously times have changed, but it was working for agencies like Rise and with the individuals that kind of worked there and have gone on to do their own agencies or whatever it might be, of just being yourself. That doesn't have to be, I'm alternative and I like tattoos and piercings, or, I'm XYZ. It's literally just being core to yourself. What are your kind of wants in life as well? And I think being accepting of the fact that you can push that across your socials and from a business perspective is quite key. I did notice that at Rise, obviously, when I worked there as well. And a lot of the agencies actually that, I'd never say I've got a favourite agency, but there's obviously agencies that I keep an eye on more than others. And it's the ones where I feel like it's really authentic to not only the people that started it and the founders, but the people that work there, and just allowing people to be themselves. And I think when you become a freelancer as well, that becomes probably even more important in a way. Because obviously, as opposed to selling a team of people, you are selling yourself. And, there's probably 10 people you could line up that look completely different, have different walks of lives, everything about them's different, but they all know the same thing. So a lot of the time, I think freelancers or clients, are buying into the freelancers.
Yeah.
So generally what I want to do with this kind of series as well for the ending is kind of ask a few, I'm going to say quick fire questions, but don't feel pressured to answer them in 5 seconds. And a lot of them would be just kind of interesting to see what everyone thinks. I think there'll be quite a lot of different answers. So the first one would be, what is your favourite book?
Favourite book? I think, if I think about the books that I've read and not put down and read as quickly as possible and been really excited about, I would say What You Do Is Who You Are by Ben Horowitz was an absolute favourite. That I've probably read that a couple of years ago. I'm a big fan of Jim Collins. I would say Good to Great is a really good starting point. I like all of his books. I like audiobooks as well, right? So I'm quite happy to listen to Jim Collins' voice. He's very passionate or impassioned about his work. It's fun to listen to. The best one I've read recently would be Quit by Annie Duke. Big fan of Annie Duke. I think she's great. And she did a book about why you should give up on stuff. And it's really persuasive. But from my own part, I'm thinking gratifying, satisfying. It's supporting some of the decisions I've made in the past as well. So Annie Duke is a great author too.
Perfect. The second one, now this is quite an open-ended question. It could go in many ways. But what's your favourite thing about working in the marketing industry as a whole?
I think that I do like the marketing industry. I like the professional services industry more. So, I like working with people and helping them to solve a particular problem they've got. I find that more easy to grasp personally from a services point of view than a product point of view. Marketing I like because it feels like you get out what you put in. The more you learn, the more you read, the more you listen to stuff. I'm very much a person that kind of builds a worldview over time, and I feel like I'm kind of sifting through stuff and thinking that's helping me, that's not helping me, so I'm going to discard that. And I feel myself improving all the time. And I think if I was in a job where I wasn't constantly improving by a slight bit every day, I would be quite bored and unsatisfied. Marketing, I think, is one area that I fell into, there's probably some other things I could have done, but I wouldn't leave it now. Even as we've said, some of the declining industries that we've talked about, there's a lot of fun to be had and a lot of learning and, transferable skills too. So yeah, learning is the big thing for me.
Definitely, I think I completely have to agree with that. It was kind of something to keep my mind switched on more than anything else. I'm quite easily distracted by many other things, so it's nice to have something that keeps my mind on. So, a couple more questions. The next one is your favorite tools within the marketing industry. So, it's sometimes hard to choose one. So, if it's kind of a top three, maybe that that can work just as well.
I'm much further away from kind of tactical stuff nowadays, and I certainly had some favorite tools when I was getting more involved in implementing SEO, especially, but lots of other things too. So I would find it hard to really choose now. I would say I've always found it really helpful to have a CRM, and I have favorite CRMs. Definitely, I'm a big fan of Pipedrive, particularly, and HubSpot's great as well. So they'd be two. And weirdly, I've never really sold CRM. I've never really kind of done that as a service, but I've always found it helpful personally. And I think whether you're a freelancer or an agency, you should have a CRM. HubSpot's free. Capsule has a free version, and Capsule's great too. So that's the one I couldn't live without. And then Xero, right, or QuickBooks or something like that. Whether you think of it as a marketing tool or not, it helps you to run your business. So Xero was one that I used and I'm a bit more familiar with.
Definitely. And the last one is probably maybe the most difficult question, depending on obviously what you see. So, and this is kind of aimed towards obviously the listeners of the podcast. So for anyone who's either just starting out freelance, maybe thinking about going freelance in the next few months, or even, I suppose, like myself, just maybe a year or so into that journey, what's your best bit of advice?
I would say have a point of view and share it with people, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's a blog, whether it's, YouTube or whatever. Everyone's different, right? I don't really watch YouTube. I have a few podcasts I listen to, but if you open my tabs on my phone, 30 blog posts open that I'm going to read. And I do sit and read them. I literally sit and send them to my laptop and read them on my laptop. But there are plenty of different ways you can do that. Is my point. I would say try and build a profile within a specific. I call it a point of view, right? We've talked about fame, and that's a really big word. I'm not the most famous man in marketing. I'm not even the most famous Stephen in marketing, right? So there's plenty of work. If you're gonna go freelance, you are going to find that there are people who want to work with you if you are sharing your expertise and can demonstrate that you know what you're doing. That's all marketing. That's all there is to it. You want to work in marketing, do marketing for yourself. That's my tip.
Perfect. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really great to just have a general catch up as well. But I think overall, as an episode, it's been very insightful. If anyone wants to follow you on socials, what platforms are best to find you on?
LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. I'm not going to read a message very quickly, and when that platform inevitably dies in the next few months, hopefully this podcast is going to be listened to for more than a few months. So, that might be gone by this point. So LinkedIn.
Perfect. No worries at all. So Stephen's profile will be within the description. But again, thank you, Stephen. Really appreciate you joining us today.
No worries, Matt. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Freelancing Friends podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I would love to hear any feedback you have. Remember to head on over to freelancingfriends.co.uk and join the community today. Also, be sure to follow the podcast on your favourite streaming services.